I'm in Rathbone. I'm going to talk to you today about preparing a model for painting. And I don't just mean the washing process to get it cleaned to apply paint, but preparation starts as soon as you open the box to start building the kit. If you're going to give someone else the job of painting it, talk to them. Ask them what they expect from you in terms of breaking down the kit to make it easy to paint and to give you ultimately a better job. You open the kit, you look at all the bits and you start putting them together. One thing you should be very careful of is making sure all the visible edges have the cusps filed off and that they're straight and square and curves are truly round and there are no etching tabs getting in the way. A professional painter will use a pair of bow compasses in the offset mode to put lines on. Along this valance, for example, there's an orange line in Great Western livery, and he'd use these compasses and he would just follow that edge around to put the line on. Any tabs or roughness along there will give you a rough line. He'll straighten it out, but he'll start to curse you at the same time. So that's rule number one. All edges straight, clean and square. I've got a crib sheet here so I won't forget anything. The painter will also like a boiler and firebox separate from the chassis, from the frame. So that can be painted easily. This bottom third of the boiler here is very difficult to get paint on without flooding the splashes or the footplate. Whereas if it's taken off, that can be sprayed around so easily and you'll get a much better job. Likewise, the tender body. This particular Mitchell kit, the tender body is separate from the base. This is green, the rest is black, which makes spraying so much easier. While I've got the Great Western body out, in Great Western days the sides are green, the black is top, but there are toolboxes which sit in here. They are green, so they're best left off until you've painted this lot, then you just glue them back in. If they're in situ and you've got to mask them off, that makes things far more complex. In BR days, of course, it doesn't matter because they're black, so you can put them on. In many of the pre-nationalisation liveries on a tender, the tender axle boxes and the springs are a different colour from the frame. The LMS being a principal example of this. Black springs and axle boxes, crimson lake frame. Leave the springs and axle boxes off. Then you spray the frame, spray the springs and axle boxes separately, get all the way around them, make sure paint gets all the nooks and crannies, then stick them on. So much easier. And they also get in the way of the lining, so after lining, put them on. Similarly, if you can't split the tender body and chassis, vacuum pipes and steam pipes cross the buffer beam and also get in the way of the lining on the back of the tender. And all pre-nationalisation companies on their green or red engines did line the back of the tender. So if you can devise a way of sticking these on afterwards, so much the better. This is the start of a black 5. These are the cab sides, covered in rivets. Now at some point after painting, you've got to put transfer numbers on there, be it LMS or BR, and the rivets get in the way. Transfers do not like rivets. Fox transfers especially don't like rivets. HMRS a little better. You can press them down over the rivets, but you can distort them at the same time. So ask yourself whether it is best to remove these rivets in the space where the numbers go. And it's best done while it's flat now, rather than when it's assembled, because you can stick it on a flat surface and scrape them off. And other little areas like that, just ask yourself, is it in the way of something? Boiler bands, a pet hate of mine. A boiler that's etched in 18 thou brass, and you're provided with half-etched boiler bands to go on, which are therefore 9 thou brass. The real-life boiler band is about 2 or 3 mil thick, which isn't much at all. On a dirty loco, you very often can't see them in the photograph. Now, a trick is that 2 or 3 mil in real life is 2 or 3 thou on the model, give or take a slight discrepancy. 1 millimetre is 1.1 thou. So, strictly speaking, your boiler band should be only 2 or 3 thou thick, which is the thickness of a transfer, or thickness of some magic tape. This is Scotch magic tape, which is opaque, and you can cut that into strips, put it around the boiler, and once it's had a coat of primer on, a couple of coats of paint and a coat of varnish, it's not going to go anywhere, and it's far more realistic than a great thick boiler band. On some kits you get a half-etched groove where the boiler band fits. You can do nothing about that. You have to live with that. On this Model U, the boiler bands are just the transfer, where they're painted boiler bands. There's a further band on the firebox here, which you may not be able to see. That is also tape, but it is under primer and paint and varnish. It's going to be quite stable, and it's quite unobtrusive, which is what you're looking for. Do not weight the boiler of the locomotive before you start painting. If it is irretrievably soldered to the body, it's going to be very heavy. The painter's going to have problems holding this, painting it, because he's just going to get fatigue. Also, when you lay it flat, or it is laid flat for the lining to go on, the steps start to buckle, and other things sticking out, if they're pretty flimsy, will start. So what I do, very often to other people's models as well as they come in, is put a reinforcing strip at the back of the step plate there. Ideally that's best done before you stick the steps on, because if you put it on afterwards, the steps fall off from the heat of the soldering iron. So reinforce first, then steps. Very often the step plate has a half-etched groove for the middle step. That is an extremely weak point, so make sure you've got plenty of solder in there. The other thing is enclosed voids. Very often if the smokebox saddle is a bent up piece of brass and you solder the boiler onto it, there's a void there. And water can get in during the washing process, but of course it can't evaporate out. So drill a couple of drain holes. Likewise on the tender, if you've got a valve cover at the front end between the two frame extensions, that again may need a drain hole, because water does get in, and once it's in there it can't evaporate naturally out, except over, say, overnight. And water will get in under the dome, safety valve, or whatever, the chimney on the tender, on the boiler, and it takes a long time to come out. Don't fit the buffers or the couplings for painting, or if you're sending it off to a painter, he's only going to curse and have to take them out again. And whatever you do, never ever at this stage solder the nut on that's holding the buffers in place. The buffers need removing to be blackened, and that's best done off the motor, off the engine. Make sure everything is straight and square. You wouldn't believe how many times I get an engine in, sometimes built by professional model makers, where the cab is not vertical. It is so simple. Make a set square out of a piece of plastic card, offer it up to the front of the cab, and just check the cab is vertical. Once you start lining an outer square cab, it looks terrible and it makes the model look worse. You could put the lining off square, but then it should be parallel to the edges. So make sure every part of the model should be square, is square. Make sure your lamp brackets are securely soldered on. Part of the process of cleaning is rubbing with a brush. Some folks use a toothbrush, that can knock off lamp brackets. And lamp brackets are very vulnerable, especially where there's a half edge to show you where the bend is. That is a very, very weak point. I would prefer to bend up a lamp bracket from a straight piece of scrap brass rather than use one with half edge dimples in it. And finally, leave out the back head. Don't solder it in. The inside of the cab is a very, very difficult area to paint. Invariably it's brush painting. You may have 2 or 3 colours in there. You've got to create boundaries. If the back head is in there, it is difficult. A Great Western back head is black at the front and it's green on the sides. To paint that is difficult if it's stuck in the cab. Putting the numbers on the dials is difficult too. I'm being facetious there. The inside of the cab is also a place where lots of crud occurs. Brass filings, all sorts of dirt, which is very often missed out when you're doing the wash. So pay particular attention to the inside of the cab. A good scrape, brush out, just to get rid of all that stuff that's in there. I know you don't look into a cab very often, but I do as I'm painting them. And if the cab roof is covered in bits, it's usually the flux from the various solderings you do, just etches parts of the brass and makes it lumpy. So just give that a good rub down with wet and dry. Make it smooth again. It's worthwhile. Now I'll just go on to coaches. I mean, coaches are a much easier prospect from locos because you haven't got all those multiple shapes to clean around and inside and stick together. You've got the roof, the body, underframe. Now ideally they'd be separate. The roof is separate to make it easy to put the furniture and then populate the inside. The underframe is easy to take off because that's usually all black and you can just spray it and then screw it up. So devise ways of doing that, but the problem is as soon as you put the coach roof on and solder it on, it makes the whole thing much more rigid and stable, which is stronger, which is what you want. Then it's difficult to get the people in, if you're going to put people in. So I devise a way of screwing down the cab roof and then screwing the body to the underframe. The problem with the body comes in 3 or 4 different colours sometimes. You may have black ends, darker lower body side, light upper side and various linings. So the main problem there is masking. If you've got your coach handles, door handles and commode handles strung along the centre line, masking is going to be very difficult. So leave those off, stick them in afterwards. Super glue, solder. If you tin the ends of the handles with a high melting point solder and solder them in with 70 degree or 145 degree, you can do that if you're quick without destroying paintwork. So practice and see if you can do it. Otherwise it's super glue. Masking along the side, it's usually around about the level of the door handles. It certainly was on BR. So crimson and cream BR, blue and grey BR, you're going to have to mask along that centre line. So keep your door handles off until you've done that. Panel coaches are slightly different in that the change of colour occurred usually above the handles where the beading was. You may have a little bit of problem at the ends if the ends are a different colour to the sides and you've got a lot of pipework, handles, the telltales for the vacuum brakes may get in the way of the masking. So whether you can leave those off until later, it is up to you. You can usually find your way around that. I'll talk about masking now. For tape masking, there's nothing better than Tamiya. Comes in a dispenser, but you can get refills, so you don't need to buy more than one dispenser. I use two widths, 10mm, 6mm, there are other widths available. I use the 10mm where the one side of the masking tape is forming the boundary, the other side is connected to a piece of paper, newspaper usually, which covers the rest of the engine. For example, on this, I would prime that with a black primer, whether it's Great Western or BR. Black primer is good undercoat for green, dark green. I then put the tape around here with the newspaper stuck to it, and the newspaper goes past here. So you get a good clean boundary like that, which this tape will do, and then spray this black. It's more awkward to paint this black first and then mask this off from that, because you normally got the chimney there, which makes it more difficult to get the newspaper around and stuff like that. That's quite an easy job. So for tapes, use Tamiya. If you're going beyond this and just working with newspaper, wrapping around a tendon, you've got to fill in joints and things, ordinary builder's masking tape is fine. But don't use this on a paint which is a bit dodgy. If it's not quite dry, or you've not used etching primer on the smooth brass, it might pull the paint off, so just be aware of that. Likewise, never cut masking tape when it's on the model, because if you nick the paint underneath, that will create a weak point. So never cut it on the model. If you've got to go between point A and point B, rather than just stretching the masking tape out and cutting it, use two shorter pieces that overlap in the middle. Then you get the boundaries correct with a bit of an overlap. There's no cutting involved. If you're going to use masking, liquid masking, some people like the whistles and safety valves bright, and you want to use liquid masking, the first thing that comes to mind is Mascol. No. Use this, Copydex. It's a fabric adhesive. It lasts longer than Mascol. Mascol degrades after 3 days and it becomes a sticky mess that doesn't cohere to itself. This stays integral for a much longer time, up to 3 weeks. and you can get this anywhere, ironmonger. And it may not be cheaper than Muscat, I don't know. I put mine on either with a cocktail stick or this paintbrush, which you can see the bristles are worn down to about 2-3 mil, and that could brush on. It creates very good boundaries, so you get a good crisp edge with this. And then you take it off when you want to. You're not limited to taking it off almost straight away. So that pretty well covers masking. We've done preparation. I'm just going to look at my crib sheet now to see what else I've missed. Right. The actual preparation for painting. Now I assume you've done your research and you've looked at a photograph of the livery you want, and you know where everything is to go, what colours, which. So we're going to start the painting process now, but it starts with cleaning. And I use various tools for the rough cleaning. Stiff brush, this is an ordinary 1/2 inch paintbrush. That is stiff enough to get into corners, to get any loose bits out. You can hold it nearer the end and make it stiffer. I don't use a toothbrush because that's less likely to take off the small parts, like lamp brackets, like I said earlier. I use dental scrapers, again for getting into corners, getting little lumps of solder out, and other dirt that's in there. A Swiss file. This is a worn out Swiss file, and I put a chisel end on it. So now I can just go across the model like this. You could even use this on paint to get hairs and dust off. It won't touch the paint because I make sure that end is smooth as well as being sharp. And the corners are just gently smoothed out, so there's no hard bits there. And this is also another Swiss file. This is a square one, comes to a point, which has a very tiny chisel point filed onto it, ground onto it in fact, and that's good in tiny parts. Scalpel, you can run that across the model, take off solder. And finally, some people hate these. I don't particularly like it because it gets in my fingers. The Fiberglass Brush. But it's an amazing tool. It will scrub down solder patches to flat, gets in corners, shines, well, it shines at brass but leaves a micro rough surface, which is what you want. But you must be extremely careful after using these. Give it a good blow over the airbrush, a rinse, and look at it with a magnifying glass, just to make sure there are no particles left. Because you won't see them against the brass. You may not see them against the matte primer, but you'll certainly see them when you see the gloss top coat go on, and then you've got to strip off and start again, because they're quite difficult to rub down and get rid of. So we move now, we've done all the mechanical stuff, we've got all the bits off. It's the bits you can't see. And for brass you need to get a micro rough surface. Brass is a very smooth metal, and the primers that come in aerosol cans are designed to use on steel in the car industry or car renovation. Steel is a rough metal. You can't see it, but it's micro rough. And there's nothing in an aerosol primer that makes it stick better than ordinary paint. It's a filler. It's designed to be sprayed on and rubbed down to a smooth finish. Now we can't always do that on model because there's too much in the way. Rivets and the like, you can't rub it down so well. So we need to create a micro rough surface to start with. Nickel silver is already more rough than brass. Brass is a greasy smooth metal, So we start getting rid of the grease. Now I use flash floor cleaner. You don't have to, there's many other makes and models on the planet. So this is basically designed to remove grease. And what it does, it reduces the surface tension of water so that it can get under the grease and lift it off. It doesn't dissolve the grease, it just gets under it. So it may not do the entire job, but it's a good start. It's also slightly alkaline, so that it will go some way to tackling the flux that's left inside, which is acidic. So that's the first one. I usually pour this out into a little marmalade jar, 1 ounce marmalade jar, and stick the brush in, brush all over, neat initially, then introduce water, and give it a good clean, all the nooks and crannies, inside and out, because the solid flux residue is inside as well. So good clean all over, and then a good rinse. Just ordinary domestic hot warm water. Give it a shake, that'll do. Don't need to dry it at this stage. The second part is an acid. Now you could use any lime scale remover. This is like I'll put in any supermarket own brand lime scale remover. This contains some hydrochloric acid, quite dilute, and that will clean the tarnish off the brass. That's all we're using this for. It has little use on nickel silver, but it will shine up the brass. So we can see that it's clean. We see any marks on it. After that, or instead of, you need an abrasive cleaner. Now I normally use shiny sinks, but I just happen to have finished my last bottle and I haven't been able to get any because of COVID, so Barkeeper's Friend is what I brought. This is it's a powder, and what you do, you mix that to form a paste with water in a sauce or something, and then you brush it on with your brush it all over, brush it in well, and that will scour the brass and take the shine away. It's producing the micro-rough, the surface we're looking for. So once that's done and you've rinsed that off, give it 2 rinses, because this is the last rinse this is the last time your model will be touching water. Put it somewhere to dry. Now, when I dry mine, I stick it on my painting stand, get the airbrush, switch that on, get the hairdryer, switch that on, turn the airbrush up to maximum pressure, blow the water off, at the same time heating it all up. The heating evaporates the water, the blowing off blows it off. You'll still have water in the voids that I mentioned before, in laminations. You can direct your airbrush at one edge of a lamination and see water coming out the other end. Mitchell tendersides are laminated, and you can do it inside. You can see all the way around inside water seeping out of where the laminations are from the inner frame. Now you're not going to get rid of all that water in a lamination. Spray the base of the dome, the base of the safety valve, chimney, whatever, and you'll see water creeping out to the side. And you get most of it out, but ultimately you won't get it all out. And some of it may still have traces of detergent in it. So wipe off what you can see with a tissue, and then when you think it's fairly dry, put it somewhere overnight to stay dry, on top of a radiator, on top of your boiler, somewhere like that. When you come to it next morning, it'll feel dry, look dry, There will be some stains on it where you haven't quite washed all the detergent off, in which case either get a cotton bud with water and just wipe it off, or a piece of tissue with water. Make sure there's no wisps of cotton bud left on the model. At this stage your main problem is dust from the air, from your clothes, from dandruff from your hair, anywhere, cat fur, whatever. The final rinse is going to be cellulose thinners. That's what I use. You may not want to use cellulose thinners, in which case use white spirit. This is to get the final possible bit of grease off, any last bits of detergent stains. Cellulose actually dissolves the grease, unlike detergent which gets underneath and washes it. Cellulose thinners dissolves it, so any remaining bit of grease off your fingers, everything, will go at this stage. Again, dip the brush in, scrub it all over, put it somewhere fresh air to dry. Take it outside if you like. And then finally, you're ready to spray. And that's a different story. So, thank you for listening. Bye.